The clock is ticking. Somewhere on a map the world keeps arguing over, soldiers are waiting. Diplomats are sweating. And millions of civilians are holding their breath, wondering if tomorrow will sound like silence. Or explosions. A ceasefire is expiring. And nobody agrees on what happens next. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel breaks down some of the most complex and urgent conflicts shaping our world, piece by piece, so you actually understand what's happening and why it matters to all of us. Today, we're diving into one of the most dangerous moments in modern conflict diplomacy, the expiry of a ceasefire agreement. What happens when the pause button runs out? Who decides whether war resumes? And is there any real chance of peace, or is the countdown already over? Stay until the end, because the final piece of this puzzle is the one most news channels won't tell you. If this kind of deep analysis matters to you, hit subscribe and let's get into it. First, let's make sure we understand the weapon being used here. Not guns. Not missiles. A ceasefire is not peace. Let that sink in. It is a temporary, formal agreement between warring parties to stop active fighting, usually for a set number of hours, days, or weeks. It doesn't end the war. It pauses it. Ceasefires have existed for as long as warfare itself. In ancient Rome, they called it an inducia, a truce that allowed armies to retrieve their dead. In World War I, soldiers from both sides famously stopped fighting on Christmas Day, 1914, and played football in no man's land. The guns fell silent, but the war didn't end. It resumed and killed millions more. Modern ceasefires serve a more strategic purpose. They create space for hostage exchanges, humanitarian aid delivery, diplomatic negotiations, and political pressure to build. They are clocks, and when a clock runs out without a new agreement, the world faces a choice. That choice is almost always the hardest one, because both sides know, once the ceasefire expires, every action the other side takes first becomes the trigger. And nobody wants to fire the first shot, but nobody wants to look weak either. This is where we are now, and this is why it's so dangerous. Here's something the history books teach us, but that most people forget. Most ceasefires don't fail because one side simply decides to restart the war. They fail quietly, through erosion. It starts with small violations. A patrol crosses a buffer zone. A sniper fires at a checkpoint. A drone appears in restricted airspace. Each side accuses the other. Neither admits fault. And the fragile silence begins to crack, one fracture at a time. This happened in Lebanon in 2006. EU unbrokered ceasefire held, barely, but violations on both sides eroded trust until the agreement was functionally meaningless within months. It happened in Ukraine after the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015. Ceasefires were signed, praised by the international community, and then quietly dismantled by artillery fire in the dead of night. The pattern is almost always the same. Phase 1, the ceasefire is announced. There is cautious optimism. Phase 2, small violations begin. Each side blames the other. Phase 3, accusations escalate. Diplomatic channels grow strained. Phase 4, a single significant incident, a bombing, an assassination, a missile strike, becomes the breaking point, and the war resumes. Right now, analysts watching the current ceasefire expiry crisis are tracking each of these phases in real time. The question isn't just whether it will hold, it's which phase we're already in. This is where it gets complicated and fascinating, because in any ceasefire crisis, there are never just two sides. There are layers. There are the primary combatants, the ones doing the fighting. Their goals often seem obvious from the outside: territory, security, survival. But even within each side, there is rarely unity. Military commanders want different things from political leaders. Hardliners want to fight. Moderates want to negotiate. And both are watching each other as closely as they're watching the enemy. Then there are the regional powers, the neighboring states who have their own interests in the outcome. Some are quietly supplying weapons to one side. Others are hosting diplomatic talks while secretly hoping those talks fail. Regional powers often benefit from a frozen conflict, one that doesn't explode into full-scale war, but that never truly resolves either. A contained conflict weakens rivals and keeps international attention focused elsewhere. And then there are the global players, the superpowers, Their involvement is rarely direct, but it is always present. Arms deals, intelligence sharing, UN Security Council votes, the threat of sanctions or the promise of reconstruction funding. These are the invisible hands that push the pieces on the board. Understanding who really wants the ceasefire to hold and who benefits from its collapse is the most important question you can ask right now. And the answer is almost never the one you'd expect, because sometimes the party loudest in calling for peace is the one quietly preparing for war. Let's step back from the geopolitics for a moment. Because behind every diplomatic deadline, there are people. During a ceasefire, something extraordinary happens in conflict zones. Markets reopen. Schools cautiously let children back in. Hospitals that were running on emergency supplies get restocked. Families separated by front lines try to reach each other. Aid convoys roll through corridors that were impassable just days before. And then, when the ceasefire appears close to collapsing, all of that reverses. Shops close again. Families pack what they can carry. Aid organizations pull their workers back to safe zones. The silence before a resumption of conflict is not peaceful, it is suffocating. We've seen this in Yemen, where ceasefires have been declared, broken, and declared again, over and over, while 21 million people remain dependent on humanitarian assistance. We've seen it in Sudan, where warring factions have signed agreements under international pressure only to resume fighting within hours. We've seen it in Syria, in South Sudan, in Nagorno-Karabakh. The civilians living through a ceasefire expiry crisis don't have the luxury of analysis. They have a choice: stay and hope, or flee and survive. That choice, made by millions of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, is the real story behind every diplomatic headline. And it's the one we owe it to them not to forget. So, what actually happens when a ceasefire deadline arrives? Historically, there are three outcomes. Let's walk through each one, and the signals that tell you which path is being taken. Outcome 1, the ceasefire is extended. Both sides agree, formally or informally, to let the pause continue. This usually happens when neither side feels ready for renewed fighting, when international pressure is intense, or when there's a real prospect of a broader peace deal. The signal to watch for: direct or back-channel communication between the parties. When diplomats are still talking, the guns usually stay quiet a little longer. Outcome 2, a new framework is negotiated. The expiring ceasefire becomes the catalyst for a more permanent agreement, a peace deal, a withdrawal framework, a political settlement. This is the rarest outcome, and usually requires all of the following: external guarantors both sides trust, a mutually acceptable compromise on the core issues, and political leadership on both sides willing to absorb the domestic criticism of making concessions. It's rare, but it happens, and when it does, it changes everything. Outcome 3, the ceasefire collapses, and war resumes. This is the outcome that makes headlines, but it rarely happens with a single dramatic declaration. More often, fighting resumes gradually, a skirmish here, an airstrike there, until the ceasefire exists only on paper, and then not at all. The signal to watch for: military movement near front lines, evacuation of civilians, suspension of aid access, and the withdrawal of international monitors. Right now, in this current crisis, all three outcomes remain on the table. But the window for outcomes 1 and 2 is narrowing. And that should concern every one of us watching from the outside. Here's the part most mainstream coverage glosses over: the thing that's actually driving this crisis, underneath the political statements and the military posturing. Ceasefires don't collapse because of ideology. They collapse because of incentives. Somewhere in every protracted conflict, someone is profiting. Weapons manufacturers, regional brokers, corrupt officials siphoning reconstruction aid, political leaders whose power depends on a population kept in fear. Peace, real, lasting peace, threatens those profits. And so peace is quietly, systematically undermined. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented history. In Angola's civil war, both sides continued fighting for decades, partly because diamond revenues funded the conflict and enriched powerful actors on both sides. In the Sahel, armed groups use conflict to control smuggling routes worth billions. In some of the world's most persistent conflicts, the fighters at the bottom have more reason to stop than the commanders at the top. When you watch a ceasefire expire, ask yourself, who benefits from the breakdown? Follow that question far enough, and you'll usually find the real reason the peace process failed. That's not cynicism, that's clarity, and clarity is exactly what's needed in a crisis like this one. The honest answer is, we don't know yet, but the signs are not reassuring. And the history of ceasefire expiry crises tells us that hope alone is not a strategy. What we do know is this: every hour a ceasefire holds is an hour that a child goes to school instead of a shelter. Every day of silence is a day humanitarian workers can reach people who are starving. Every week of negotiations is a week in which a political miracle, however unlikely, remains possible. The ceasefire expiry crisis isn't just a story about two sides and a deadline. It's a story about what we, as a global community, are willing to do to prevent the worst. It's a test of whether international institutions can still matter. And it's a reminder that war is never inevitable, right up until the moment it begins. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening, and why, please give it a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want to understand the world without the noise. Subscribe if you haven't already. We break down conflicts like this every week, from the geopolitics to the human stories behind the headlines. And I want to hear from you. In your view, is there any diplomatic path that can still hold this ceasefire together? Or is the collapse already inevitable? Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and stay human.